What a morning. I needed to talk to Dad to try to fix that thing, and I forgot my phone. And I sent her a message, and she doesn't read her email in the morning.
Joy called and said that they took him home yesterday and
Did they fix his gallbladder?
yeah, they took it out. It was the size of a football and it's supposed to be the size of a sausage.
Wow.
So
Huh.
doing good.
Well, that's good. Okay, this chair can go back up here. Let's see, how did I do this last time? I stood here and I had the sign here. Rebecca, last week, did I have the sign here? The board? Okay. Still running, that's good. Have to erase them and make them smaller or something, yeah. I still got a few minutes. Yep, it only shows up to ostriches. Unless maybe what if I put the sign over on this side up here. And then I moved over here. Yeah, that would work. Let's lock the wheels so it doesn't roll. Okay. And we'll just take down a couple of these. Yeah, because I only have 8. Okay.
That's what I told her. I said, just bring the boxes
6, 7, 8, 9.
Get her fixed?
Well, I think so. We think it's running now. I started it early just so we could keep running, so check it. Okay, good.
She had to have me order something on Amazon one time. I'm like, okay,
Yeah, and everyone can hear you because I have the mic on. I could turn the mic off. Okay. Yeah, let's talk about all the funny people here. Okay, well, we think we have this system working again. We hope so. It was working here a few minutes ago. So we missed the last 2 Sunday schools and 2 sermons, but we actually recorded the sermon last week on the computer, so hopefully I'll be able to figure out how to send it to YouTube, and so we will have last week's sermon. But we're going to see if we can find a simpler way of doing things that's not as tricky and getting lost. Well, this is our 39th week in the book of Job. We're in Job chapter 39 today for the whole message. Jesus has come in a golden whirlwind to correct Job, to turn him from his wrong accusations about God, and to restore his relationship with God. So Jesus speaks for 4 chapters. That's chapters 38 to 41. Now, Jesus talked first about the topics of water and light, and he went back and forth between them 3 times, each time going a little deeper. But he asks Job now about animals. Now, I told you that there were 10, and that's because a bunch of commentators said there were 10 animals, but it turns out there might only be 8 or 9, probably 9. And here on the chart, I made a little modification. This is where I missed one, according to some commentators. There is one little phrase in the ibex paragraph that says hinds, which usually means deer. But a lot of scholars now say that that's just sort of like a synonym for the ibexes. So God wasn't talking about 2 different animals, but only 1. In which case, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. It does seem there might be 2 different words for hawks or eagles, but they might be the same. It doesn't matter that much. All it means is that I kept saying there were 10 animals. There might only be 8 or 9. But we'll go with 9, but we'll talk more about eagles than hawks today. So at any rate, Jesus talked about a bunch of animals, and he asked Job questions about them to show that he doesn't know nearly as much as he thinks he knows, even though they live in his region. I mean, if you think about it, how many of you guys know about some of our local strange creatures? There's a lot of odd creatures around here that most people don't even know about. Strange creatures, yeah, that would include me. But we have interesting tortoises and turtles and salamanders and even slugs. But you probably don't know much about them, even though you live here and you've seen them. You just, ew, and then that's about it. That's all you care about them. But God knows all about them. Jesus made them, and not only did he create them, he watches them all the time, and he helps them. He cares about all those little creatures, even the creeping things. Now, in Genesis, we were told there are 3 different kinds of animals, types. That's what God made in Genesis 1, although you could say 5. In Genesis chapter 1, toward the end, on the day 6, it says he made wild animals, domestic animals, and creeping things. But on day 5, he made birds and fish. Some people think that birds and fish are included among creeping things. I don't know, we don't have time to go into that. We'll go into that in Genesis when we get there in a couple of months. But anyway, only a small percentage of the creatures God made are domestic. Now, what domestic means in Genesis, it means people-likers. They hang around with people. Some animals like people. It's kind of strange. You wonder why they like people, but you can think of obvious ones, dogs. Dogs really like people. So it's possible that God made dogs domestic. Also some cows. Although it's possible that a lot of cows descended from the aurochses, and the aurochses don't like people. But at any rate, there are some creatures like sheep and goats. They hang out with people. We protect them in exchange for their products. It's sort of a social contract we have. God only made a few domestic creatures. We have created a few more over the years, including horses. We'll get to that today. Horses were not originally domestic creatures, but we've made them such. Just like we've made cows out of aurochses. So what that means, though, is that let's say there's 20. I think I've read of 16, but let's say there's 20 domestic species on Earth. Then how many species of non-domestic creatures are there? Millions. Which means that only a tiny percentage of the creatures God made were meant for people to live with. That means that most animals were meant for people not to live with. So God is telling Job, you know, you think you know all about your domestic animals. I'm sure you know a lot about camels and donkeys and oxen and sheep because you owned them, but you know nothing about all the other creatures, and I got to take care of them too. You're not the only guy on earth, and you're not the only one with animals. So anyway, Jesus starts asking Job about these other animals that he doesn't know about. First, he talked about lions. But his implication was not so much on how dangerous they are, but whether Job would even care about them. Would Job want to help lions, baby lions? You know, if you were a cattle rancher and you're out riding your horse and you find a dead calf, you're going to be upset. The calf was eaten by lions. And then you ride along a little further and you see a little cave and you hear mewing and you go up and there's little baby lions in there. Are you going to help them? Or are you going to kill them? That's a tough question. Ranchers perhaps would kill them, although it's illegal. But or what if you had already shot the one who killed your calf, the mountain lion, and then you discovered she had babies nearby? Are you going to take care of them? You're going to call the zoo? Or are you just going to kill them? I think that was the question for Job. What are you going to do with these predators? Do you care about predators? And God says, I care about predators. He says, I don't care what you think. Isn't that interesting? God does not care what you think about his wild animals, if you don't like them. If you don't like spiders, well, but too bad for you. There's spiders all over the place. So anyway, that was the question for Job in the lions. Then he brought up ravens. And Jesus quotes himself in the Gospel of Luke, in Luke 12:24. Jesus quotes from Job, or at least infers from it. Consider the ravens, they neither sow nor reap, they have neither storehouse nor barn, yet God feeds them. That's what was said in Job. God feeds the ravens. Of how much more value are you than the birds? Then Jesus talks about wild mountain goats. Those are the ibexes up here. He mostly talks about their offspring. The first two animals, lions and ravens, both talked about babies also. Jesus seems to be saying in these first three paragraphs, he feeds young lions, he feeds young ravens, and now he feeds baby goats. So why is God talking about baby animals? It's because Job is angry at God for killing his children. At least we have to assume that. I'm guessing that the reason that Job accuses God of cruelty and not listening to people and allowing the wicked to go free and the innocent to die, he's thinking of his kids. My kids were innocent and they died. And you killed them. I mean, how did they die? They died in a great windstorm that just coincidentally blew down the house they were in. That's an act of God, as far as he knows. So he accuses God of cruelty. Many unbelievers and writers nowadays still accuse God of cruelty, especially the Old Testament. There are a lot of people who say that the Old Testament is not even God. They claim it's some kind of a demon who impersonated God and got the Jews to worship him. That's how much disparagement we've had of the Old Testament. That God in the Old Testament was cruel. He ordered people to kill Canaanites and commit genocide and kill their babies and all these horrible things, commit sacrifices, blood and animals. God would never do that. Well, they're wrong about that. Job is starting to think that way also, that God is cruel. And that's why Jesus comes back in person to turn Job back to the right way. The hardest step in fixing Job over the question of God is the question of his children. So Jesus is giving Job the same lesson he will give you in the Gospels 2,000 years later. Matthew 6:25-27. I say to you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat or what you will drink, nor about your body, what you will wear. Is not life more than food and the body more than clothing? Just look at the birds of the air. They neither sow nor reap nor gather into barns, yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not of more value than they? So Jesus takes this piece of Job. He's particularly probably talking about the ravens, but also today we'll look at the hawks and the eagles. He's talking about birds. He says if God feeds birds, even wild birds, even birds you don't like ravens and eagles, wouldn't he take care of humans also? It's the Jewish logical syllogism. It's an ancient way of interpreting the Bible, and it's a correct one. That you can often, maybe not always, you can often reason from the lesser truth to the greater truth. So for example, let's say there's some laws in Leviticus about washing your hands. You might think it's ridiculous that you have to wash your hands every time. But it's possible that the lesson of washing your hands is a small way of looking at the greater things like washing your heart and repentance. Jesus is saying, God takes care of ravens, therefore God takes care of humans even more. You are of more value than they are. So Jesus is telling Job, I take care of useless creatures in your eyes. You don't even think they're worth taking care of. I care for them. I cared for your children too. That's the greater lesson. I cared more about them than you did. So you're wrong when you say that I'm cruel. Everything I did was just and caring. So Job thinks that the death of his children means God didn't care about them. Jesus said, no, God is watching everything and cares about everything. He even cares about non-born goats, goats in the wombs of their mothers. Jesus also says in the last part of that verse on mountain goats, their young ones are healthy, they grow strong with grain, then they depart and do not return to them. Jesus says that a lot of times parents lose their children and don't even know it. Your kids move away. Nowadays we have telephones. You know, in the old days, before telephones, you had to write letters. So you might not know that your kids had died until some friend sends you a letter that he died months ago. You get it. And before letters, I mean, you'd have to wait for someone to actually travel to visit you to tell you that someone died. In the animal world, like the mountain goats, the babies leave their mother at like 6 months and they may never meet again. So the mother doesn't know. So Jesus is telling Job, you may not even know what happened to your kids. You happen to know in this case, but a lot of animals don't know. But I know, and I care. So Jesus says, if I take care of lions and birds and goats, I also take care of humans. I never forget them. Every creature is mine. He knows about all of them, and he doesn't just know about them, he cares about all of them. So when Job hears about how God cares about animals, it's not a zoology lesson. It's not just, oh, that's neat, trivia. Jesus says God cares about everything and watches them with compassion and justice. So last week we covered 3 more animals, the onagers, the aurochses, and the ostriches. The onager is the wild donkey. They can live in the desert because they've learned ways, they have adapted over the centuries and millennia to live in desert climates. One thing they're able to do that most animals can't, similar to elephants though, is they've learned to dig for water. When you live in the desert, the onager can sort of smell humidity from as much as a foot down, I believe, through the sand. So they can find a dry water bed and dig a hole down to it and get water. So that's one reason they can survive out there. Jesus talks about how much they love their freedom. And it seems to imply, the way he says it, that the onagers used to be domesticated. I think that before the flood, the onager was working with humans, like donkeys do now, and that we bred them and we kept them around. But after the flood, it appears that even though we kept some donkeys around and bred them, there were also the wild versions who didn't like being in servitude. And that's what Jesus says. They laugh at the tame ones when they run by. They won't let you near them. You can't get within half a mile of an onager unless you're at a zoo, because they run away when they see you. They don't want you to enslave them again, is what Jesus says. And I think that what Jesus is doing in that passage is he's showing you the contradiction between free will and divine providence. In other words, these wild donkeys, what they seem to think is, ha ha, I'm free. You can't catch me. When in fact, Jesus is in total control of them all the time. He's the one who controls their finding water and they're finding food and they're running along. So that's the same sort of argument we have these days. Do you have your free will or do you have Jesus controlling you, God controlling you? Well, the fact of the matter is both. He controls you even when you act of your own free will, because he controls you using your free will. Now, free will is only a thing that Christians have. Non-Christians don't have free will. But I think that's what Jesus was saying about these onagers. Even if they don't know it, they're under God's control. Oh, and one person that they compared, that Jesus uses the Bible to compare to an onager, is King Nebuchadnezzar. King Nebuchadnezzar got proud, and you remember God took away his mind and says he gave him the mind of a beast. And then it says he lived in the fields with the onagers. In other words, he wasn't just living in a pasture with the cows. He was actually living out in the desert, growing long fingernails, growing long hair, eating on all fours, eating grass, and he lived with the onagers. That's really interesting too, because the onagers let him. I already told you, onagers won't let a human near them. But apparently they got used to Nebuchadnezzar because he was like one of them. So he was just one of the onager herd. Very odd. That's in Daniel 5:21, by the way. Then in verses 9 through 12, we looked at wild oxen. Oh, by the way, some of you might have in your King James unicorns. But we don't think unicorn is the right word. The King James translators used the Greek, and for some reason the Greek used one-eyed beast. And no one knows why they did that, because none of the Hebrew says anything about, or one-horned beast, I mean, not one-eyed beast. So anyway, we think that it's the wild ox. This aurochs was sort of like Babe the Blue Ox, like Paul Bunyan's giant bull. Probably not quite that big, but they say that aurochses in their prime used to be about the size of an elephant. So they would be 3 or 4 times bigger than a modern cow. And no one could control them. They were aggressive. If you think the Spanish bullfights show aggressive bulls, they're actually terrified bulls. But anyway, an aurochs would be sort of like a rhinoceros charging at you. Huge, and you can't turn him aside easily. He's going to attack you and kill you if he can. They're territorial. See, the reason rhinoceroses attack, though, is because they can't see you. They're practically blind. They smell something strange, and they either run or they attack. And generally, they attack. They smell something weird. Well, the aurochs was the same way, but he could probably see you, and thus he'd be more dangerous than the rhino. But anyway, the aurochs was used in the Roman arenas, like the Colosseum, for entertainment. People killing aurochses was one of the biggest events at the games for the Romans because they were so big and huge and scary. But the aurochs being larger than any modern cow, Jesus tells Job, he's kind of sarcastic about it even. He says, are you going to capture one of those giant aurochses and have him pull your cart with grain to town? Or are you going to harness him to your plow and plow your fields with him, Job? You better not. He's going to kill you. That's what Jesus says. He says, there are some animals that you shouldn't mess with. They're just too large and too dangerous. Aurochses went extinct in 1627 in Poland. The last one died. So they lasted quite a while in Europe. But lastly, we have the ostrich. And the ostrich is one of the strangest ones. A lot of scholars wonder, why did Jesus talk about ostriches? Because they're so weird. And what Jesus says about them is pretty weird too. The ostrich is the most massive bird on earth. It doesn't have the biggest wingspan. The biggest wingspan is the albatross, somewhere around 12 to 13 feet. California condor is about 10 feet. But the ostrich is by far the heaviest bird. The condor, I think, can weigh up to 10 pounds, maybe 12. The ostrich can weigh 300 pounds, if I remember correctly. Also, they can be much bigger than the ones you see these days at the zoo. The ones you see at the zoo are mostly 6 to 7 feet tall. There have been some in captivity 100 years ago that were over 10 feet tall. So really big ostriches. But what's interesting is that a lot of people say that this little paragraph proves that the book of Job can't be inspired because Jesus says some things about ostriches that they say is wrong, inaccurate. But actually, we talked about last week, I showed you, they're just not understanding what part of the ostrich's behavior Jesus was really referring to. What it says is, Jesus says the ostrich doesn't care for its offspring, doesn't care if it dies. That is true of most ostriches, but not all. And here's the way it works. A male ostrich has a harem of 4 to 8 birds, females. Only one of the females is the main bird, the one he really likes. The other ones are just tagging along. When they lay a nest, they create a nest in the dirt. All of them lay their eggs in the nest. But only one female sits on the eggs. That's the favorite female. And when she sits on the eggs every night, the very first night she sits on the eggs, she sniffs them, and if it's not her egg, she pushes it out of the nest. So you end up with 40 or 50 eggs all around the nest. And the other females don't do anything. They don't take care of them. They don't sit on them. They don't warm them. Which means that they start to rot and get soft, and they don't even care if predators come in. If little groundhogs or badgers or whatever run in, they can just grab an egg and take it. If it's not in the main nest, nobody cares. So it's true then what Jesus said. The main ostrich cares for her babies, but all the rest of the ostriches don't care about their babies. Okay? So that's what's being said. It's not false. It's just a different aspect of the question. But it's also interesting what Jesus says about ostriches. He talks about how dumb they are, which is something of an acknowledgement that there is sort of a hierarchy of smartness in animals. Plato has often been attacked for his idea called the Great Chain of Being. And in the Great Chain of Being, Plato basically said there's God, and there's angels, and then there's humans, and then there's this kind of animal, and this kind of animal, and this kind of animal, and he makes a list of the ones he thinks are the smartest. A lot of people have attacked him for this list. There is a basis for a hierarchy, and this verse shows that. There are some animals that even God says, that's a pretty dumb one there, the ostriches. He didn't give them a lot of sense. They often die in accidents. If you care for ostriches, the farmers who care for ostriches have to be really careful. You have to ostrich-proof your fields. You know how you child-proof your rooms? Like you put little plugs in the safety plugs so they don't stick their fingers in there and die? You know, things like that. You put up gates so they don't go in the kitchen and burn themselves. That's what it is with ostriches. If you've got a free hanging wire somewhere, they will run right through it and basically cut their head off as they run by. I mean, they're really not very smart. They don't notice. Even if they see the wire, they don't know it's going to hurt them until it's too late. So anyway, ostriches are dumb. Why then did Jesus talk about ostriches? I think what Jesus is saying is this. I made predators. I made scavengers. I made climbers. I made wanderers. I made aggressive animals. I made stupid animals. He's just saying, I made all kinds of animals, and you have no idea about them. So he just threw in a stupid one. So today now we will finish chapter 39 with 3 more desert creatures, or 3 or 2. And we're starting with the horse in verses 19 to 25. Have you given the horse strength? Have you clothed his neck with thunder? Can you frighten him like a locust? His majestic snorting strikes terror. He paws in the valley and rejoices in his strength. He gallops into the clash of arms. He mocks at fear and is not frightened, nor does he turn back from the sword. The quiver rattles against him, the glittering spear and javelin. He devours the distance with fierceness and rage, nor does he come to a halt because the trumpet has sounded. At the blast of the trumpet he says, "Aha!" He smells the battle from afar, the thunder of captains and shouting. Now there's one main point that you may completely misunderstand in this paragraph about horses. And that's partly because you may not know a lot about horses, but it's also because we're looking at a very ancient text here, and we're looking at it in a modern way. It's one of the main points in my book, Animals in the Military. I forgot to bring it. I was going to show it to you. You may have seen it before. I have about 100 pages on horses in there. So I guess I'm a little bit of a horse expert, in warfare at least. So anyway, in this chapter on horses, what I learned was really remarkable. You see, horses in the ancient world, until 1,000 years after the time of Job, were not used for armies. In fact, the reason they were not used for armies is because they were so small. 3,000 years ago, the horse was about the size of a golden retriever. That's as big as they got. You've seen in museums, I'm sure you've seen museums that have the evolutionary progression of horses, and they show you Eohippus. Eohippus is supposedly the ancient version of the horse. And it's about this big, like a dog. Not believing in evolution, I believe that the Eohippus was actually the first type of horse that God made. And we can prove that in that the size of horse skeletons have grown dramatically over the last 4,000 years. In other words, here's what happened. We had Eohippus, a small, fast, dog-like horse. And we had no idea what to do with him. They were kind of friendly, and they're kind of easy to train. But what do you do with a fast dog horse? You can't ride it. It's too small to ride. Your legs will touch the ground. But somebody got the bright idea of thinking, well, if we could make this animal bigger, maybe he could be useful. So people started breeding them. Every time you get a big Eohippus, you'd breed it with another big Eohippus and get a little bigger Eohippus. It took thousands of years of this kind of breeding, before the flood and after the flood probably, to create the warhorse. In fact, it's not until 700 BC that the Assyrians had horses big enough to ride on. Now, like the donkey, you could ride on a donkey, you could ride on a horse. The trouble was their backs weren't strong enough to hold a human's weight. They could only hold about 50 pounds until they got bigger. Most humans, even small men, weigh at least 100 and 150 pounds. The only place on the horse you could ride it was on his back haunches, which means that the reins were really long if you tried to control him, and you'd fall forward very easily. There's not much use riding on the back of a horse. It's not until they got big enough for someone to ride on his back that he became useful, when he could carry weight. So what did we do with horses? The first people, it seems, to use horses, at least in the Western world, were the Egyptians. And what did they do? Do you know what they did with horses before you could ride them? What were they good for? They pulled carts, yes. And what else? what did they pull that was like a cart for the army? Chariots. Yes, the Egyptians invented chariots probably around 12 to 1400 BC, around the time that Moses was living there. They were then big enough to harness to a cart and pull it. Now, the first chariots had to be very light. They were made basically of bamboo and wicker, because the horse, the more weight he has to pull, the slower he goes. The advantage to the chariot was speed. You ride around and just the guy in the back with his sword or spear stabbing people, or the archer shooting people. So the first use of the horse was the chariot. If you read the paragraph carefully, you will notice that it nowhere mentions people riding horses. It says they were in the army. It says that they were attacking people in battle, but it says nothing about people riding them. All it says is their speed is amazing, they laugh at the enemy, they charge forward at the sound of the trumpet. Those are chariot horses. So that's an important thing to remember. If you're reading this and you're thinking of guys on cavalry horses riding into battle, nope. Nobody was riding on them. The horses were still too small. It took another 500 years of the Assyrians and Persians breeding them to get horses big enough to ride on. So chariot battles were the main thing from about 1400 BC to about 800 BC when we got bigger horses. They also discovered you could add 2 horses or 3 horses or 4 horses to a chariot to pull it even faster. And once you had more horses, you could add a heavier chariot and more guys in the back, till you basically had a tank being pulled by horses, a little armor and guys with arrows and stuff. So that's the development of the horse. Now, the reason I bring all that up is also for you to understand Jesus here is talking about trained horses, not wild horses. Wild horses and all horses we know of are afraid of battle. Horses, in fact, are some of the most skittish creatures on earth. They're afraid of everything, kind of like my dog Kia. She's afraid of everything, even babies. It takes her a long time to get used to anything new. Horses are the same way. When you capture a horse, it's terrified. And every time you try to put a saddle on it, it's terrified. Until it gets used to you. And it takes years of training, or at least many months, to teach it that you're not going to hurt it, you're going to feed it, you're going to put the saddle on and it won't hurt it. You know, all these things you have to teach the horse. So what Jesus is talking about here is not wild horses. This is the only creature in this list that is not wild. And we'll talk about why in a minute. Every other creature here is outside of human control except the horse. They are easily frightened. Darwin, in one of his books, Charles Darwin, I really like Darwin, reading him. I mean, he's a good writer. I think that's one reason his theory was so persuasive, because he's a good writer. But he talked about riding his horse, and he would ride his horse, and he'd say, suddenly it would panic. It would see its shadow, or it would hear the flapping of plastic in the wind, and it would whinny up and rear up and be terrified and then run as fast as it could away, and he'd be trying to hold on. He was talking about how terrified horses are. So the horse is the only domestic animal in this chapter. Why would Jesus put a domestic creature in here when he was talking about wild animals? The first 3 animals Jesus talked about because they cared for their babies and God cared for their babies. So that's the first 3. The next 3 animals God talked about were untamable. You can't tame the wild donkey because you can't catch him. You can't tame the aurochs because he'll kill you. You can't tame the ostrich because it's too stupid to learn anything. Okay, so babies, untamable, and now we reach the last part, and it's a little different. Why does he bring up horses? Because you can train them. In other words, Jesus is saying, I did make some creatures that you can tame, and the horse is one of them. So he brags about how you are able to turn a horse into a weapon of war. In other words, it is in the nature of the horse, it's genetic. There's an author named Budiansky, Stephen Budiansky, and he's written a couple of books on the history of animal domestication, and they're very good. I've talked to him by email a couple of times when I was writing my book, a couple of my books. But anyway, he shows, and correctly so, that some animals are genetically disposed to like humans, and which just happens to be exactly what God says in Genesis 1, that I made some animals who want to live with people. Same thing. But he's an evolutionist. He's not a believer. I don't think he has any religion at all, actually. But even he admits that there are some animals who choose to live with humans, and they're genetically disposed to do so, and horses are among them. So this is a confirmation even from the atheistic side. But what is he saying about horses? That they're emotional, but their qualities enable them to overcome their fears. In other words, with enough teaching, you can teach your dog or your horse to get over its fears. Let's say your dog is afraid of babies. If you give my dog Kia a baby once in a while, after a few hours, she's starting to get used to the baby and not bark at it and be afraid of it. It's the same with the horse. With enough training, you can teach it to trust you. And it will trust that if you're going into battle, it's safe for him to go into battle. And eventually, he'll even start to like it because he gets to run and all those sorts of things. So God is saying, Jesus is saying, I've made these animals who want to work with you, and you are able to teach them. No one growing up with horses would say that they're brave and unafraid. They're not. They're afraid of everything. What do they do when you see a baby horse and you approach it? What does it usually do? It runs and hides under its mom or behind its mom. That's what most baby animals do. They're not naturally brave. Cows scare horses. Most horses are scared of cows. Here's what I think Jesus is doing here. Jesus is telling Job that with some guidance and training, I can train you to be courageous again. What we have here is Job used to be a really brave, courageous, godly man, and now he's broken. And it's interesting that you can use that same term for the training of horses that you can use for the training of humans, in a sense. God doesn't train you until he breaks you, because you're not willing to learn until you're broken. This is the whole idea behind the process of boot camp, is my understanding. I've never been through it, but my understanding is that in boot camp, they break you so that you stop being such an arrogant fool, and you learn stuff, and once you're broken, you can learn stuff. You discover that the officers know more than you do. Well, I don't know if that's true, but it's not true, okay. At least the master sergeant knows more than you do and will teach you how to do things right, or the way the army wants. It's the same with God. He has to chip away at you, and you have to fail enough to realize that you can't do it yourself, and God will help you with it. So I think what Jesus is doing is he's getting away from these animals that are hard to relate to and saying, here's you, Job. You need to be broken, and I can teach you how to be brave again. In other words, we need to be domesticated too. When you're an unbeliever, you're like these guys. You're a wild wanderer. You're either aggressive, you charge at people when they bring religion into your sight, or you run away from them like the wild donkey, or you're too stupid to understand it. There's also that possibility. But all of these can be viewed as representations of various kinds of people. And yet, God does care about them all and has methods of fixing us. And I think that's what he's telling Job. Job, I can fix you. I can work with you. Now that you've been broken, I can start making you courageous again. If a human can train a horse to overcome its fears, God can train a human to overcome his or her fears too. So notice that Jesus is ascribing human feelings to horses. This is called anthropomorphism. This is how we try to understand why horses do things, their motivations. I do think that horses have similar feelings to humans. Most mammals do. But I think the reason Jesus is giving us an example, or giving us examples of all these animals and their feelings, is so that we also think about our own feelings. You know, Jesus is the one who gave animals emotions, and Jesus is the one who gave humans emotions. In our modern day, we like to think of ourselves as logical, reasoning creatures. And every day, ad nauseum on the news, you see these politicians, trying to find a word that's not too harsh, telling you, we're just following the science. They're full of it. They are not following the science. Science is nothing but data interpreted, and they're interpreting the science their way. The fact of the matter is that almost all humans, with almost no exceptions, act wholly out of emotion and not reasoning. It is very rare that you find a human who acts on reason. Most people haven't been taught reason. It's not something that's taught in schools anymore for the most part. The most useful class I ever had, I took in high school. My first year of college was an elective, and it was logic. And I learned more from the logic class than I learned in any other class in the history of my schooling. How do you think? That's what logic is. How do you think? No one knows that anymore. If you don't know how to think, how are you going to reason? How are you going to even interpret the science? They're not. They're getting data and they're looking at it and they're saying, look at all these sick people. We're all going to die. That is emotion. That's not reasoning. So The media or a political party, they've convinced people, in fact, what we want to believe. And what most people want to believe, we believe in hedonism. Hedonism is the god of the United States. Hedonism means, it's a philosophy that says that pleasure is the greatest good and pain is the greatest evil. Therefore, the goal of our lives is to be without pain and happy a lot, all the time if you can. And thus, the media and the politicians are telling people, you're not happy? You must be a victim. Someone is hurting you. Someone is not giving you your due, or you would be happy. Therefore, you have to take it. And in order to take it, you need to put us in power, and we will take it for you. We'll get you your happiness back. That's the promise of one of our political parties. And the media tells you that if you're not feeling pleasure, or if you feel pain, it's because there's a huge conspiracy of racists, sexists, homophobe, religious zealots, and they're all oppressing you. And we'll fix those problems for you so you're not oppressed, and then you'll be happy. And then you can be your happy hedonist again. That's what we have coming out of schools, is hedonist kids who think that they deserve everything. And the only way to fix that is to riot in the streets or vote for us. This is a lie. One of the messages in the book of Job is that pleasure and pain are both given by God to every human. The most godly human on earth is suffering like a dog with leprosy all over his body, great pain, his friends hate him, everyone's tormenting him, the angels are bothering him, and all his kids are dead, and his family, his wife left him. That's the most godly guy on earth, and that's how much pain he went through. And the reason he went through all that, there are many reasons. One reason, his reason, was to break him so that God could make him even better. There were many other reasons. God's glorifying himself. God's proving that Satan's a liar, etc., etc. It is a lie to think that you should always be in great pleasure. I'm trying to remember, there was a famous author, was it Sproul, who wrote a book, The Problem of Pleasure, rather than Problem of Pain? Somebody wrote a book called that, and he's right. That is our problem. We think that we deserve pleasure all the time and we should avoid pain. That's not the way Job tells us. But the party that wants you to believe them doesn't even talk about God, or if they talk about God, he's just a false God who helps them. They actually believe that murder is good, selfishness is good, bribery is good, rioting is good, stealing is good, attacking your enemies is good, perversion is good, and you can believe that they're champion of God because he goes by a Catholic church at Christmas and Easter. That's why you should believe him. So at any rate, Job needs training, and Jesus is going to give it to him. And he's telling him that, just like a war horse, I'm going to teach you now. So that's the end of horses. Now we'll go to hawks and eagles. It is possible that it's just one bird using the same term, or the different terms. There are different terms used here. Or it could be two different birds. But at any rate, both birds share many of the same characteristics because they're all birds of prey. Hawks and eagles are birds of prey. A bird of prey is a bird that generally kills for its food. We don't call ravens birds of prey. They occasionally kill for their food, but it's not their usual method. They're scavengers. They just eat anything. And if they happen to find something that's still partly alive, they'll finish it off. Birds of prey usually kill. They will when they're hungry, and when they have babies, they will scavenge. Eagles are scavengers, hawks are scavengers. You'll often see them, the hawks around here, sitting on the phone lines alongside the freeways. That's because they're watching for us to run over those little animals, and when there's no cars coming, they'll fly down and grab the body and take it away and eat it. So even birds of prey are not above being scavengers when they're hungry enough. But let's look at those last few verses of chapter 39. It's verses 26 to 30. Does the hawk fly by your wisdom and spread its wings toward the south? Does the eagle mount up by your command or make its nest on high? On the rock it dwells and resides, on the crag of the rock and the stronghold. From there it spies out the prey, its eyes observe from afar. Its young ones suck up blood, and where the slain are, there it is. So Jesus talks about these birds in one paragraph. So these are animals probably 8 and 9. I already told you how I missed the hind, but I'm not sure that the hind was meant to be a separate creature. I think it's still the ibex. So we probably have only 8 or 9 animals, not 10. Now, I learned a lot about birds of prey over the last couple of years when I lived at the Grand Canyon and worked on the train, on the railroad. Because 1 mile out of the train station, every day, both ways, we went by a giant osprey nest. Now the truth is it was probably an eagle nest, and the eagles abandoned it and built a new one, and the ospreys took it over because it's far bigger than a normal osprey nest. It probably was about 8 feet wide, 8-foot diameter across, and 8 feet tall, deep. Ospreys don't usually build nests that big, but the eagles do. But anyway, every day we would see osprey in there, usually at least one, occasionally two. One always stays home, the mother, female, usually stays home to watch the babies, to make sure that enemies don't come and eat them, because other eagles or hawks or even ravens will land in the nest and kill the babies and eat them if they get the chance. So always one bird waits home. The male's usually out hunting. Ospreys are hunting for fish. Their nest, they like that nest because it was only a few hundred yards from a lake, and they live on fish. So they would fly over the lake, look down. They have special eyes that are able to look through the water up to 2 feet deep, even in murky water. They can see the disturbances, that means there's a fish there. And then they'll put their claws out and dive, grab that fish, and its claws pierce the fish's heart and lungs so that it dies instantly. And this is why you sometimes find dead birds, eagles and ospreys, at the side of a lake. Because if they misjudge and pick a really huge fish, if they miss the heart and lungs and the fish still is alive, the fish will swim under and drag them under. They can't let go. They're locked. Their claws are locked, their talons. The only way they can pull them out is to get out of the water, fly to the nest, and pull it out of their talons. They can't just let it go like we can with our fingers. That's why you find dead birds. If the fish drowns them, their bodies will eventually wash up on the shore. But anyway, we also had vultures circling over cattle carcasses. We had California condors who are scavengers. But we often saw hawks hunting. And the reason is, if you think about it, as a train goes by, it makes a lot of noise and rattles the ground. We would often see groundhogs and rats and mice and creatures popping their heads up to look and see what is all the commotion about. So the hawks would fly alongside the train, parallel and at our speed, watching. And when these little animals pop their heads out, you'd see the hawk go, grab that guy right out of the ground. So we were like helping feed the hawks. Well, Jesus mentions that they build their nests high up on the rocks. That's in the Middle East because they don't have very many trees. But in our area, they lived high in nests. The reason they build their nests up high is so that if raccoons or snakes try to come up the tree to eat the babies, they'll see it and chase it away. Also, it gives them a great way to spy on the area. And an eagle, they say, can see a mouse 2 miles away. That's how good their vision is. Jesus says they observe their prey from afar, up to 2 miles afar. And when they see it, then they can fly down and grab the food. You'll also notice that it says that the babies suck up the blood. A lot of people thought that was nonsense. It's not nonsense. What happens is the eagle or the hawk partially digests the food and then regurgitates it into the baby's mouth. And so the babies are slurping the goo and the blood right out of mama's neck. They're sucking the blood out. No, you like that, George. So that's what they do. That's how they survive. You'll see it with penguins too. All birds regurgitate. I have a bird, a conure. She'll sit on my shoulder, and if I go, she'll start going, trying to bring up some stuff to feed me with, because that's the signal the baby wants food, is making that clicking noise. So she thinks that I'm wanting food, and I'm like, no, I don't need that. But all birds do that. Yum, yum. So once again, Jesus is saying that the babies are of great importance, and he wants them to be fed. So Jesus ends his list of animals. He's reminding Job again that the caring providence of God extends to all animals and therefore also to humans. And so he ends his speech to Job with that reminder again. I never forgot about your kids. I was compassionate and justice with your children. So now, let's do an overview of chapters 38 and 39. And it will not be a review per se, because there are many larger themes from the big picture rather than the small details. We've been going through mostly the small details of each animal. And now let's talk about the big picture of these chapters. One thing to notice is that Jesus does not comfort Job in the human way. Comfort is a hard thing to do. It's a difficult job. It's one of the hardest things to do. You don't know what to say. That's basically it. Knowing what to say or what not to say takes a lot of discernment. But one thing you learn for sure in Jesus' speech, he recognizes what Job needs, not what Job wants. Job might think that he wants comfort, Jesus doesn't give him the kind of comfort he wants. To some degree he does. He does explain that I cared about your children. What Job needs more, though, than comfort is perspective. You see, this is different than mere knowledge. Jesus gives data about 8 or 9 animals here to Job. This isn't mere data. That won't help a depressed person. That's not what Job needs. It's the perspective that Job needs. Even if Job knew all of these interesting, trivial things about these 9 creatures, that will not help him stop being depressed. It's like watching a nature show is going to make you cheer up, maybe a little, but not a lot. The meaning behind the trivia is that Jesus knows and controls and rules everything on earth all the time. Every animal, every human. It's all under God's control. God is totally sovereign in the weather, in the light, in the universe, and in the animal world. Therefore, he is also totally sovereign in the human world. Everything that ever happens was done because God wanted it to happen that way. Nothing surprised him. Oh, wow, I wasn't expecting that. God never says that. So a surface look at this strategy is that Jesus was telling Job, stop your constant introspection. See, this is one of the problems in depression, is you're spending all your time looking at yourself. Woe is me, everything's horrible. Everything is not horrible. You think it's horrible, you feel that it's horrible. God says it's not horrible. You are misunderstanding the universe. I'm doing everything so that things will be better, for you included. So Jesus is turning Job away from his constant self-introspection. Look at the rest of the world, Job. Stop your tunnel vision. Look at everything else that's going on. There are lots of good things going on in the world, including wild animals. He is trying to reset Job's ingrown brain. It's like your modem quits working or stops connecting to the internet. What do? What's the first thing they tell you when you call the service department? Did you try turning it off and turning it back on? Reset it. A depressed person or a person who's in great sorrow eventually will have to reset his brain, or God will reset it for him, if he's a Christian, so that he's no longer only thinking about himself, but he sees the world again. You got to get out of your hole. Depressed people usually hide at home in their bedrooms, in their closets. They don't want to talk to people because they're too busy introspecting. Jesus says, it's time to quit introspecting, Job. You got to get back out in the world and see that I'm at work here. That's one theme. Okay, next, what was the tone or the mood in the voice of Jesus toward Job? Now, many scholars say that Jesus was brutal and harsh and cruel, and God is just daring Job. Attack me one more time, Job. I've got a lightning bolt ready for you. Go ahead, tell me I'm cruel. He wants to do it. I don't think that's what Jesus was doing. Now, it is true that Jesus was annoyed. He said at the very beginning, who is this fool who's dishonoring me? Basically is what he says. So he is annoyed, but he's not furious. He's not going to kill Job. But these people say God doesn't care about Job's problems. God completely detaches himself from Job's suffering, and he starts talking about animals. What good is that? That's the superficial reading of Job. That's not the correct reading of Job. What they have forgotten to some degree is that this is poetry. Poetry, you don't read poetry like you read a novel. Poetry is meant to be digested bit by bit, thought about carefully. It's like studying deeply. That's because it's trying to get at emotions and deeper issues rather than just your simple movie script. Your simple action movie script is really simple. Poetry is not simple. Jesus is showing the details of his creatures in poetry, and you have to think about it. Now, Jesus shows that he cared about the animals. This is Job's biggest question, though. The biggest question, the one that he kept asking is, why? Why did you do this, God? Jesus does not answer why. I don't think he ever answers why. In fact, the disciples asked him one time about people who died in accidents. That remember the Tower of Siloam fell and killed 18 people. Why would God do that? Were those people more wicked than the rest of the people around? And Jesus said, no. God wanted to show his works. Okay? So why wasn't really answered, except that God wanted it to happen. That's exactly what Job is learning. Why questions are often a challenge. Sometimes when a child asks why, it's not because he really doesn't know, it's because he says, why do I have to do that? That's not asking why, that's a challenge, doesn't want to do it. So It's a tricky question to ask God because you're asking for God's motivation. Why did you do that, God? Then the question you have to ask is, why do you have the right to know? You think you got the right to know why God did something to you? He's probably not going to answer the why question. So Job asked why. Jesus answers what, not why. What did I do to you and your family, Job? I did to you what I do to every animal on earth. I watched you and I cared for you, and some bad things happened to you that you won't understand, but those actions were for the best. Everything I do is for the better interest of that creature. So he doesn't answer why, he answers what. He says, I'm loving and I'm just. Everything that happened to you is in my divine plan. You are a creature just like light and water and animals. I care about you more than I care about those things, but you have to trust me. If you ask why, it means you don't trust them. That's really the basis of why. You don't really want to know what or why. You want to know if he's sure he's trying to help you. You're questioning your relationship. So Jesus is not angry. He's just displeased. It's a mild correction. One of the major themes, obviously, is that Jesus is saying, my universe is not out of control. There is chaos, there is pain. That is the result of the fall. There is sin, and there's Satan, and there's demons, and there's evil. But for us, we too need to recognize that God is in control of everything. Let's say, for the sake of argument, that the Antichrist becomes the President of the United States. And then Antifa takes over the streets and all the police resign all over the country. And we devolve into anarchy. And one political party takes over where we murder babies at will. And we give out free money to junkies and thieves. What do we do then? Guess what? God is still in control of the world. And he's still in control of Antifa and the Antichrist and the druggies and the junkies and the idiots running the country. Even if all that goes wrong. God is then in control in a state of judgment for us. It's going to be very bad news for us if that was to happen. But God is still in control of it, even when Satan runs things, because God is in control of Satan. See? So we think of control as good, but when control hurts us, we don't like it. That's where Job is. Job loved his life before, when God was in control. Job doesn't like his life now. He just doesn't realize God is still in control even now. So one thing in Jesus' speech that I don't think is a coincidence, by the way, about these animals, just a final note, is that all four of the cherubim faces are here. You remember the cherubim? They are the weird angelic creatures that stand around the throne. One of them has the face of a man. He's talking to Job now, so that would be the face of a man. What's the first one? Lion. What's the last one? Eagle. And what's the middle one? Bull. God has these creatures around his throne, and we're told that the flood and the rainbow, for instance, were symbols that God will always remember not to curse the earth. I believe that the presence of the cherubim with their four faces, those are the four major animal kingdoms on earth. Humans, mammals, birds, and predators. I realize some predators are mammals, but at any rate. So I think that every time God looks down and sees the cherubim worshiping him, he remembers all of the animals as well as all of the humans. We're all living things created by God. And that's what Jesus is saying. Every creature on earth is under my control. So this book of Job, this first two chapters of Jesus' speech, this is a small, sketchy framework of the whole doctrine of the whole Bible. Creation, fall, and redemption. And within redemption is restoration, where not only souls, but the entire cosmos is fixed and repaired. So the restoration of the universe, Jesus brags about his animals, not because they will never again exist and he's going to burn them all to a cinder on the burned earth and we're all going to live with wings in heaven and flap around in the golden city. No, we're going to live on the new heavens and the new earth and with the animals as well. I think these are all part of the theme of the Bible, and whenever Jesus speaks, he speaks about creation, fall, redemption. Okay, well that's it for today. Hopefully it's still running. It looks like it's still running. Any questions? We're going to go on to chapters 40 and 41, the last two chapters, starting next week. Okay, if there's no questions, I'll turn off the sound and turn off the video. We'll be back in about 30 minutes for the worship service.